Welcome to today's webinar, Inflation, How It's Affecting Food Waste. We've all seen the news stories about inflation. We've all been living this personally as we go to the grocery store or out to eat, and in particular, seeing how food prices have been on the rise. So what does that mean for food waste? We're really excited to host today's panel discussion to start digging into that question. My name is Jackie Suggett. I'm the Director of Capital Innovation and Engagement here at ReFED. I'll be your moderator today. And before I introduce our panelists, I want to take a couple of minutes to give you a few updates about ReFED and some of our other upcoming events. As many of you know, ReFED is a national nonprofit working to end food loss and waste across the US food system by advancing data-driven solutions. Our vision, like many of yours, I am sure, is a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient food system that makes the best use of the food that we grow. Last year, we introduced 2 free resources that are available on our website. First is the ReFED Insights Engine. Second is the Roadmap to 2030. Both of these were created to help support the food system's efforts to cut food waste by 50% by the year 2030. What we try to do with events like this then is to pull all of the data, the solutions that are detailed in those resources off the page and bring them to life for you through the expertise and experience of the panelists that we bring to speak. We announce all of our upcoming webinars in emails to our subscriber list. So if you're not already signed up for that, you will see a link coming through the chat box now, and we encourage you to do so. But I do want to highlight 2 upcoming events that we'd love for you to join us for really quick before we kick off our session. The first is an event that we are presenting in partnership with our friends at the Food Waste Reduction Alliance. It's called Food Waste at Retail, Insights from the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment. We'll be sharing our analysis of unsold food rates and food destinations and the subsequent impacts at the retail level specifically. It's all based on data that we've collected and analyzed from signatories of the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, including Walmart, Kroger, Sprouts, Raley's, and more. And we'll talk about what the findings mean, how they can be used by other businesses to jumpstart their own waste reduction efforts. This is taking place right after Labor Day weekend on Thursday, September 8th. So you should all be very well rested and ready for more events. And you can register for it by clicking on the link in the chat box. We have another event coming up in September. It's called Sparking Innovation, the Power of Catalytic Capital in Food Waste Reduction. And we're really excited to be presenting this one in partnership with Impact Alpha, the leading source for information on impact investing and sustainable finance. Dennis Price from Impact Alpha will be our moderator. He'll be speaking with Margot Kane from Spring Point Partners, Sarah Kearney from Prime Coalition, and ReFED's own Angel Vesa about how funders can unlock outsized impact by deploying their capital in a catalytic manner, how to avoid common pitfalls, and why catalytic capital is so important to advancing food waste solutions. This event is hosted by the Food Waste Funder Circle. It's open to everyone. It's taking place on Thursday, September 15th, and there's a link to register coming through the chat box now. With that, without any further ado, let's get to today's discussion. Studies show that the price of groceries for consumers has increased by more than 12% from over a year ago. This includes higher prices for most items that we see, but significant increases for specific items such as eggs, chicken, bacon, and beef. In restaurants, prices have increased due to increases in wholesale costs for food items. Couple examples for you, the cost of scallops has increased 118% since just before the pandemic, which has made it untenable for some restaurants to even offer them because they would have to charge so much. A more common ingredient, canola oil for cooking, has increased by 159%, which also gets factored into menu prices. But what do all of these higher prices mean for food waste? In our own lives as consumers, we might have found that higher prices have made us more mindful of waste in our homes. Maybe we don't buy as much food as we might have previously, or we make better use of the food that we do buy. But what about grocery stores? What about restaurants? How is inflation affecting their food waste reduction efforts? After all, as we saw during the pandemic, even though supply chains were disrupted, crops were still growing, cows were still producing milk. So what's happening to all that food? I'm very excited to introduce you to today's panel, who will be joining me to dig into these questions. First, we have Dr. Brenna Ellison. She's an associate professor and undergraduate programs coordinator in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. Her research focuses on how consumers make food choices, including how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted food acquisition behaviors. She also studies what consumers choose not to eat or waste. Dr. Ellison earned her bachelor's in agribusiness from Abilene Christian University and her master's and PhD in agricultural economics from Oklahoma State University. Welcome, Brenna. Next, we have Constantine Zvereff, Chief Executive Officer for Blue Cart Inc., which offers an all-in-one e-commerce and wholesale order management platform for businesses in the hospitality and food industries. Constantine was born in Barcelona, has lived in Kenya, Uganda, Mozambique, and now Silicon Valley. He taught biology in Mozambique, worked for Bear Stearns Securitizing Longevities, received his MBA, and returned to Africa to work for and with thousands of farmers in East Africa. Now back in the US, his mission at Blue Cart is to help the hospitality and food industries streamline their processes and better serve their customers. Welcome, Constantine. And then we have Erika Thiem, Chief Supply Chain Officer at Feeding America, where she leads a team that enables Feeding America and its 200 food bank network to source and distribute nutritious food for people facing hunger in America. Her team works to innovate and build donor partnerships with food manufacturers, retailers, food service operators, and agricultural food producers to meet today's demand for healthy food and work to create a hunger-free tomorrow. Erika began her career with General Mills, where she spent 27 years across a range of diverse roles and business units. She also served as a board member for 6 years with the Food Group, a food banking organization based in Minnesota. Erika earned her Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Iowa State University and an MBA from the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management. Welcome, Erika. I don't think I need to say it, but we have an excellent panel today. Very excited to dive into the conversation with them. Thank you all for joining us. We're at ReFED are very excited about this conversation, but I can also tell you that the audience is as well. We've had a lot of requests from people to dig into this topic a bit more. So hopefully we'll get some great engagement through the chat with questions. I'm going to go ahead and get started with a couple of questions that I wanted to ask, but wanted to pause and invite our attendees again to be using the chat box to ask any questions that you have for our panelists over the discussion here. With that, I'm going to stop talking and ask a question of all of you really quickly. And I want to dig in and kind of set the stage by asking, what does it actually mean when we hear in the media that food prices have risen by more than 12%? Are we talking across all sectors? Are we talking across all products or just some products? What are you seeing from your specific vantage points about how inflation is affecting food prices specifically? Maybe Brenna, we can start with you.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jackie. When I hear food prices have risen, as an economist, I immediately think of the Consumer Price Index, and there is specifically a Consumer Price Index for food. And when we talk about the CPI, that's where essentially we're collecting prices. We're collecting prices on specific food products and tracking them over time, right? And so what we've seen over the past few years is that prices are going up throughout COVID, but then they've really hit hard with inflation in 2022. The Consumer Price Index does actually have prices for both food at home products as well, so things in grocery stores, but as well as food away from home in restaurants. Typically, price rises historically have been higher in food away from home, and we've really seen a flip in the past 2 years, 2021 and 2022, in terms of where we're seeing that. So U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service actually predicts these. And so just what I looked up today, in 2022, food at home is expected to increase 10 to 11% for 2022, whereas food away from home is 6.5 to 7.5%. So they do actually track it for different things. And so that's where at least I'm starting from when I talk about inflation.
Thank you. Constantine, Erika, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, well, this is Constantine. Thank you very much for having me. So just at a very high level, you know, as you mentioned, Blue Cart today has about 103,000 restaurants on the network. So when I was invited to participate in this webinar, we actually did a little bit of homework and dug in to see essentially how our restaurants are spending their money buying inputs, right? And what was the impact of inflation in the purchasing habits of our restaurants. And what we've clearly identified that it's very input sensitive, right? So those verticals that are very dependent on inputs, and especially when those inputs are highly perishable, right, are going to have a very clear upward trend on average order size and prices. And if those inputs are not as if those inputs are not as sensitive to price increases, then we won't see that effect. Now, what's really interesting is trying to discern why the price increases are taking place. Some of it's very obvious, like inflation driven, right? But from the restaurant industry, the biggest challenge that we're facing is a labor shortage, right? So for example, the example that you gave on scallops, right? Scallops are not input dependent, right? Meaning that the inputs to like get scallops are literally just put gas in the boat and hire people. So, but if you have a very hard time hiring people and you have to pay higher wages, right? Then that's going to have the impact that you probably see today on scallop prices.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I will get more into food service and restaurants here in a bit, I think, and ask you to go into that in more detail. Erika, maybe just to add to the question for you a little bit, because you bring a unique perspective to this. As you're answering this, just maybe think about how has food price inflation impacted your work at Feeding America? And what changes has this current inflationary environment caused your team to implement? And how do you see that affecting food waste and food rescue?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Jackie. And I see there are a number of participants that are from food banking. So I'm glad to have you on the call today. And I was looking at, just a chat that Autumn put in the chat too. And, I'll start with food inflation is impacting all of us, and it's impacting families and individuals that are on the edge of poverty, or might be folks who are working hard at one or more jobs, trying to make ends meet. And it is a layered impact of rent, childcare, overtime, car breaks down, all the factors that can tip someone into that family budget stretching beyond what it can manage. To help for basic needs. So in food banking, what we see in light of the inflationary environment that we are in is need that is at a level for food assistance that is as great as it was at the height of the pandemic. We've just completed a fiscal period at Feeding America, and we're able to distribute over 6 billion pounds of food. And as we think about the mission that ReFED has, we really see kind of in the order of making less waste. And then when there is waste, how do we make sure that waste is getting to people to consume whenever possible before it gets to other sustainable ways to recycle or compost. We have a gap of close to 3 billion pounds between that 6 million and what we really believe the need for food is in the United States. So while we're glad that the pandemic is easing, the need for food assistance is really sustained in light of this inflationary environment. And what that's causing is it's challenging as programs have kind of sunsetted related to USDA support for COVID relief programs, child tax credit incentives, other support programs that have helped families through the pandemic. As those have expired, food banks are trying to find more sources of food. The supply chain is still very tight with retailers and manufacturers. So food that is available to sell needs to be on store shelves. There's still a very tight supply chain and low inventory levels. So the opportunity for donated food is minimized, but we have some great bright spots. We are seeing great partnerships from retailers, and we are moving into broadliners. We are moving into convenience stores. We are getting closer. Many of our partners are working with even restaurant rescue of ready-to-eat foods, and we have seen that channel of food rescue increase. So we know that we've got really strong partnerships with grocery store retailers and other retail outlets to make sure that we're taking food many times a week that can't be sold for whatever reason, and getting that into the hands of people who can enjoy that food. It also means that we're spending more money to purchase food. And every dollar that we need to use to purchase food doesn't go as far in this inflationary environment as it did before. My example is a jar of peanut butter is $1 more than it was a year ago. And 43% of Feeding America food banks are actually going into a deficit budget planning cycle, meaning that they are planning to spend more money to purchase food than they have planned income from fundraising. So it's an environment where food banks are being very careful to think about how they fill the gap where we're missing either government, federal commodity foods, or potentially donated food streams with purchased food, and that's that's certainly a challenge in terms of budgetary planning, and then availability of that food once we do order it. So those are a few things that are affecting food banking.
That's fascinating, not in a great way, Erika, to hear several of those stats. Just hearing that the demand is as high now as it was at peak pandemic, I think is eye-opening. And then to think about that challenge of lower donations coming in for you, but then higher prices when you have to go out and buy it. So I want to dive into that demand a little bit more later on in the discussion here, but thank you for setting the stage now. That was a great transition into talking about food waste specifically and how that's impacted by these food prices. So I think logically, one would think that if food prices have gone up, we'd be wasting less food. So I'd like maybe each of you to respond quickly about if that's what you've been seeing. Have higher prices actually been leading to less waste? Or are there areas where we're seeing more waste generation because of inflation? I'll let you all decide who wants to jump in on that first, but give us a sense of what you're seeing on the impacts of food waste.
Well, this is Constantine. We unfortunately do not have perfect visibility into food waste in a way that we can provide quantitative like insight. But as a general kind of like thesis, the biggest problem in the restaurant industry with regards to food waste is the fact that we have a fixed menu, right? Our expectations that we're going to find tomatoes or broccoli year-round, fresh broccoli in New York, right, is not realistic, right? So, but we have this fixed menu that is going to drive food waste just by the fact that we have to fulfill this demand. Some of the most successful restaurants that we have today on the platform, right, do not have a fixed menu, right? That essentially like they have a set of inputs, a set of ingredients, and that's how they're going to design their daily menu, right? And as a result, there's very little food waste, right? People going to these restaurants, particularly knowing that they're going to have a brand new menu every day, and they're going to be surprised by the creativity of the given chef or whoever is cooking that day, right? So I believe that increase in food prices will generate additional innovation, right? And more people to think about how to manage this more expensive resource.
Thank you for that positive spin, Constantine. And it's more innovation might be the solution instead of more waste. Thank you. Brenna or Erika, what would you add?
I would just quickly kind of second, economic research has pretty clearly shown, even in the past, before we had times of inflation, that higher food prices are associated with less household waste because households want to better manage resources that cost more. So we don't have great household data tracking on food waste to where we could comment about the magnitude that we're experiencing. But I think, from the research that's available, there's pretty good consensus that we would expect less food waste as food prices rise. One way that inflation could potentially increase waste at the household level is if people started buying in bulk and those people don't manage that bulk food inventory well, right? So we can imagine going to Sam's or Costco to buy bulk produce, but if you don't know how to manage it, it could go bad quickly before you could use it all. But, one caveat is not all households will have the ability to do that in this inflationary environment, but that's one potential way you could see it. We're just unclear how likely that is to be happening right now.
Yeah, and Jackie, one thing, to build on that, I'm curious about is the salvage market. And I was just listening to a piece on New York Times whether it's organizations like a Flash Food or Misfit, Imperfect type organization, or traditional like salvage thrift store type grocery outlets, I am seeing increase in that. I'm seeing it as a solution to retailers and manufacturers as another way to get economic value out of unsaleable foods on the store shelf and a step before a donation to a food bank. So I see that as as families are struggling with their grocery budgets, it's an innovation in a way, another outlet for folks to get food that normally wouldn't sell at a grocery store in this secondary market. It's also it's an interesting challenge for us to think about in food banking as a another rescue step before a donation. So we're seeing that as a new place of innovation that's, I think, spurred out of this inflationary environment.
Yeah, and Erika, I'm glad you actually mentioned that. I want to maybe go back to it really quickly because we had a question come in on salvage grocery stores as you were speaking, so it was really good timing. And basically, they said the same thing you did, but asked, this seems to be a viable solution, but it also seems that it's getting ignored as a solution, and they're wondering why. Do you have any insight as to maybe why those haven't been seen, or maybe at least not just talked about as solutions as much as they should be?
Yeah, I'll say that I'm not an expert, but just as I've been reading, I think there's a lot of work going on, just making sure that these outlets are branded in a way that doesn't feel like the bakery thrift store outlet that felt like there was a stigma, or that was a place that you'd prefer not to shop at if you had means to shop other places. I think in the environment we're in right now, they're more in need. And I think some of these outlets are looking to other retail models on how they have a wide variety of food, maybe more predictable variety of food, and that they create an environment for shopping that feels more akin to a typical grocery store feel. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch and see where that goes.
Awesome. Thank you for that insight. All right, so you've each started to talk a little bit, and you're all representing a different link in our supply chain here. So I want to maybe go one by one and dive a bit deeper into your respective sectors. So Constantine, starting with you, let's talk about the food service space. You already mentioned some of the challenges around things like fixed menus, but how are restaurants dealing with rising food prices, and how is that affecting waste that both the restaurants and their consumers are producing? So maybe talk a little bit back of house and front of house for us on this one.
So just a little bit of context as well. We recently, as of like last quarter, we acquired another company called Restaurant Revolution. And what they do is they manage the off-premise business for a restaurant, meaning allowing the restaurant to publish their menu into Uber Eats, DoorDash, and their website, and collect those orders into their POS. So that allows us to have visibility into the front of the house transactions that these restaurants have during this kind of this really wild period. I mean, if you think about it, there's labor shortage, inflation, COVID, potential recession, all of those ingredients. You have to make sense out of that stuff. So backtracking a little bit, what we did is before this call, what we did is we looked at vertical specific purchasing habits of these restaurants. We see that there is a very clear increase, for example, in the average size of wholesale meats, a very clear consistent increase in the average size of an order for produce. So as you can imagine, those are very input dependent. So we do expect that average order size price increase. So then that kind of the next layer that we looked into was vertical specific. So is the average order size correlated with increases in individual inputs, right? Or is just are they just buying more, right? And for example, for seafood, we see that the average order size is very affected by seasonality, but we do see a decrease in average input price and a decrease in average order size, which is really strange because in the summers when we expect to see increases in seafood sales. But maybe the fact that there's more people willing to go fishing when there's good weather might justify some of that. I'm not really sure. The other component is wholesale produce. Like I mentioned, this one is infinitely more complicated because it's also affected by the macro environment, right? So if you have, the war in Ukraine that is affecting inputs, or, you take a big chunk of production out of that just world market, right, is going to affect our local prices, right? So we do see a very, very sharp increase, faster than the CPI on certain products, like lettuce, for example, is just crazy how much that price has increased, right? So and the same thing happens in wholesale meats, right? We're also very grain dependent, so also affected by the macro environment, right? So we do see an increase in the average item price. And it's also affected by labor shortages, right? So I'm sure you guys are tracking as well, kind of the impact of temporary visas for people to work on some of these farms and so forth, right? That has a direct impact on how much people can actually produce, right? So if they produce less, then the price will go up. So it's just as if this problem wasn't complex enough, like it has so many different ingredients, right? And other aspects, right? We see that really surprising, and this is just because our data is probably not statistically significant, right? Is we don't see the expected sharp increase, for example, on baked goods, right? Where it is input dependent, but just from a speculations perspective, right? The fact that it's not highly perishable, right? Might mean that people might be depleting their inventories and there might be a lag time before we start seeing that increases in prices. So, but that's just pure speculation on my side. I don't really have the answer to that. Where we see something really interesting is looking at the front of the house, right? So, and from the front of the house perspective, we only have visibility to the off-premise business for restaurants, meaning kind of like the Uber Eats, the DoorDashes, that type of component. So we don't see kind of like the on-premise business, yeah? And we see a continuous increase in order price, continuous increase in order size, ever since COVID. And across all of our clients, there's some clients that have suffered a very big COVID-driven loss, and that's because they relied on catering business, office business, parties, and obviously all the office catering business that's gone. So, so those restaurants are the only ones that have seen temporarily decrease in their off-premise business. But otherwise, for the off-premise business for these restaurants, it is an ever accelerating trend. Like, you know, there's more and more orders coming in, orders of greater size. People are getting very creative with their off-premise business, meaning they're creating like local brands. So I might have kind of like a, you know, a brand that I'm known for, but I create a specific like brand to cater to a specific audience, right? And that's actually generating a lot of, so essentially the challenges created by COVID generate a lot of innovation, which is kind of like what I expect to see with inflation, right? People are going to be creative. People are going to be a little bit more flexible and think outside the box, how to solve and address this very, very difficult environment.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. I know, like personally, the number of food delivery apps on my phone has probably tripled since what it was pre-COVID. Right. So that checks out in our household. And I think just that goes to show how complex it is when we go and we see the price of a food item on a receipt when we eat out, right? It's never as simple as just they're charging more. It's all those inputs of food and labor and everything that are driving that up. So thank you for walking us through that. Erika, I want to go to you next. You partner all across the supply chain, so you're probably getting a glimpse in a lot of different business types. What are you seeing from food retailers and manufacturers as it relates to food sourcing for food banks? So going back to some of the demand talking points you had in the previous question. So what are you seeing in terms of food demand at this moment in time, and are you seeing food donations keep pace?
Yeah, I mentioned, demand still remains very high. We're seeing some bright spots. I mentioned grocery retail food rescue is up. Some of the things that are helping make that possible are working with national and regional retailers on safe handling of food. When I think about my earliest experience with food banks, you'd think about packaged food, cans of soup, boxes of mac and cheese. Really, when you go into a food bank or a pantry today, hopefully you are seeing fresh produce, you're seeing protein sources, you're seeing dairy foods. So making sure that we've built an infrastructure in food banking that allows for the full assortment that you or I would like to see at a grocery store in terms of, I saw in the chat, healthy nutrition in terms of food, fresh foods, and foods that would typically be perishable instead of shelf stable. So we are seeing a lot of that through our grocery rescue. And I just really have to compliment, our donors and partners that have worked with us to trust that we have the right food safety protocols and training in place so that we can safely move refrigerated or frozen foods or soon to perish foods in a way that's very efficient, and make sure that the person who ends up enjoying that food has a safe and enjoyable experience with it. We're also seeing, as certainly as we went through the shift from food service and restaurants closing at the start of the pandemic, and kind of a glut of food service packaged foods, and the shift to high demand for retail sizes. During that period, we've learned as a food banking organization how to handle and be more responsive to various pack sizes and formats of partially processed food, ingredient pack, food service pack. So we have USDA certified clean rooms in 8 of our food banks across the United States that are able to open and reportion protein foods under USDA certification. So we can handle a large food service pack or break down pack sizes that make it more conducive to someone to take home and put in their commercial or their household refrigerator, freezer. We're also working with the dairy industry. We've had a strong partnership to do more with fresh milk. There were also periods of time when there's excess fluid milk, and making sure that we can do first run bottling of drinking milk and offer that in addition to more longer shelf life versions of butter, cheese, yogurt, et cetera, so that families can enjoy having a gallon of milk at home as well. So those are some areas that we're working differently with different types of food to get more towards fresh food rescue and making sure that we're able to accommodate different sources of food, including the food service industry. I saw in the chat too, just thinking about restaurant applications. One example that's been in place a long time is a partnership with Starbucks and their food share program. So every Starbucks outlet in the United States has a way for Feeding America agency partners to pick up food that cannot be consumed in their food outlet. It's a great program, but that food needs to be moved directly to someone in need quickly. It's typically got 48 hours of life on it. So making sure that we are kind of taking the big food bank warehouse out of that supply chain step, and making sure that the food pantry, the Boys and Girls Club, the homeless shelter, the partners that we work with that actually interface with a neighbor who needs food, are the ones that are locally partnering with that rescue from, in this example, Starbucks, so that we can move that food directly from the donor to the person, within hours. And that's really what I see as our model that we need to continue to work on with the restaurant industry, is how do we take those prepared foods that need to be consumed very quickly and either get them through our commercial kitchen and feeding program or meal programs that many of our food banks have, or partner directly with a pantry that has a feeding program, so that those foods can be used instead of wasted.
Yeah, thank you, Erika. It's been just fascinating to watch. I think just amazing work done by Feeding America and others in the food recovery space in a time where you've had to be so reactive to shifting demand and supply of food and operating in such short time frames. So thank you for sharing a glimpse of that with us. Brenna, I want to come to you now and talk about consumers for a second. Tell us a little bit about consumer food management skills, what you're seeing happen as a result of these higher prices, and would also love to hear if you're seeing that vary across demographic groups as well.
Sure. Kind of like we mentioned earlier, higher food prices just naturally incentivizes households to do better with their food resource management. We actually did a survey of U.S. consumers of about 1,000 people earlier this month and tried to dig down into the actual coping strategies that kind of go with food resource management. And we're finding that some of the biggest changes they're making are changing to cheaper brands or private label brands. You're seeing people cut back on non-food purchases. At least some people are reporting cutting back on restaurant spending. I don't know if that's the case in all households, but some are. And then we also see changing, substituting away from certain products. So we're seeing households reporting buying less red meat, less seafood, and less sweets and snacks, which is kind of interesting to me. Like in times of stress, I tend to eat more of those. But, for some people, these may be unnecessary goods. And so these are things they're cutting back on. Demographics wise, not surprisingly, we're seeing that low income and food insecure households are being hit the hardest, and they're the ones having to employ the highest amount of these coping strategies. But the reality is, when we ask people, on a scale of 0 to 10, how impacted have you felt by inflation? The average across all incomes, all food security status groups is a 7. So in general, it seems like everyone is feeling affected at this point and is adjusting their behavior accordingly.
Thank you, but I have to ask a follow-up question because I saw this come through the chat, and as a mother of 3 young kids, this just really hit home. But someone asked, like, is there a point at which eating out becomes cheaper than eating at home, and could there be a shift in kind of that balance of price at any point? What might we see long-term behavior change in where consumers are getting their food primarily?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the inflation predictions for, like last year and this year, yeah, it seems like food at home costs are catching up quickly. And yeah, as someone with 2 small children at home, like the convenience is very high for restaurants, for our household. The reality is, at least for 2023, they're predicting that, again, food away from home will kind of outpace food at home prices, but that remains to be seen if it follows through as predicted. I'm not sure what that equilibrium is or where that crossover point is, but I too at my home wonder the same type of question.
I don't know if I should admit how much I would like that to shift, but yes, perhaps not. Great. Okay, let's start talking about some solutions really quick. And this is a question for all of you to chime in on, but we have a lot of food waste professionals in the audience today that are working on this issue full time. So how can we be leveraging this moment that in many ways is so challenging to help decrease the amount of food going to waste or increase the amount of food being rescued for hunger relief? Let me pause there, but I might add on to that question, but let me pause there and see what thoughts you have as far as how we can leverage this moment in time.
Well, I can jump in. Let me see. Obviously, I already mentioned one, which is that the fact that we have an expectation of finding certain products year round in areas where obviously those products don't grow. And that leads to like a significant carbon footprint and inefficiencies all around, and obviously food waste. Something that I would love to like mention is during COVID, as Erika mentioned, right, there was we all read those articles of food being wasted. There were like all these wholesale suppliers that couldn't find a market for their milk, for their needs, and they were just dumping this food everywhere, right? And for those of you who don't know, we actually partnered with ReFED back then to develop a functionality that allowed our wholesale suppliers to sell their products directly to consumers. So through that platform, we're actually selling like millions of products, not ourselves, but our suppliers. So they're finding an outlet when they have excess production and reaching consumers directly. So that was really interesting. And I think that's a testament of what we can expect, which is, like I said, I think there's going to be significant innovation to address these new challenges, right? Just like, the innovation that we saw when COVID hit, a restaurant had to figure out how to continue to operate, and they found that off-premise was part of the solution. I sense that as this whole nightmare unfolds with which labor shortages, inflation, COVID, potential recession, all of these new components happen, right? People are going to have to be extremely creative to stay in business. So I don't have the solution, but I know the solution is going to be innovation. And I'm happy to have this kind of like front row seats to see how this takes place.
Thank you, Constantine. Erika?
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in and say, I think there are a lot of important incentives that help the food industry make sure that they are taking steps to salvage and rescue food before it needs to be disposed. So making sure that the enhanced tax incentives for donors are there. We are also at Feeding America doing a lot with agricultural growers and farmers. Their labor is a big impact, as Constantine has mentioned, but there are often crops of vegetables and fruits that can be harvested 2 or 3 cycles of harvest. Or there are certain market conditions that make a very difficult decision for a grower on, do they spend money to harvest and get less than they hoped from a crop at retail, or do they just leave it in the ground? So we're also continuing to work in terms of advocacy on how we can make sure to support rescuing and gleaning of produce, and making sure that those growers are they're given fair compensation for the cost that they have put into those crops, and making sure that we're creating access to harvest those and get them into the hunger relief sector. So I think continuing to work on financial incentives that continue to support donation and rescue of food as a step before, even before more sustainable ways to compost or take food to energy, and then ultimately, to avoid landfill is the last resort.
That's great. Brenna, anything you'd like to add?
Just on the household side, I would say, in terms of a solution, it's not a good one, but the fact that people's wallets have been hit so hard, like we know the best motivator for reducing waste at households is financial reasons, even though a lot of people talk about environmental effects and social effects. Realistically, the wallet is what changes behavior. So, that in itself could be a solution that results in long-term change. But I think educational efforts should also continue to focus on good food resource management. Like as with the other sectors that we've talked about, it's kind of bred innovation and creativity, even in households, for how to stretch your food and food dollars. And so I think, collectively activist groups and advocacy groups can focus on, interesting hacks and ideas on how to stretch our food and our food dollars. We've got people that are interested in kind of these citizen science approaches. So like not just, how do we not do this, but how, the positive spin, like how can we, stretch and be creative and do different things. So I think maybe just kind of reframing the issue and talking more about how do we use our food instead of not waste it, if that makes sense. It's a small reframe, but I think has the potential to attract more interest.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that's actually been a theme that all three of you have brought up now, is innovation in those respective sectors of being forced to do things differently. And that has spurred a lot of great innovation. All right, I want to shift now to some more of our questions from the audience. We've had a very active chat. I do not think we'll get to all of these today, but we will get to as many as we can, and have tried to connect some in throughout the discussion. But let me start, maybe Erika, with a question for you. And others may be able to chime in on this as well, but people are asking about the types of food waste you're seeing as far as the products, and has that shifted recently to be a different mix of products than maybe it was before an inflationary state or a pandemic state?
Yeah, it has a bit. And when you think about food, my prior work experience was with a branded food company like General Mills. One thing that I've seen, not related to inflation as much as it was during the supply chain tightness throughout the pandemic, is fewer new product launches and maybe a smaller SKU portfolio that some manufacturers have, just to I'm sure respond to the need to keep items on store shelves and keep customers stocked. So they were really focusing on being efficient with challenges to inbound raw materials, and looking at a very complex portfolio and trying to simplify that in a time when demand levels were high and supply chain challenges were increasing. Those new item launches or the seasonal items are often the products that don't sell well, or companies try to forecast what is expected for demand, and they get that right or wrong. And so those kind of opportunistic ways that charities like Feeding America are able to access donations because of kind of waste in the manufacturing and retail supply chains through broad SKU portfolios, I see that as a shift. And I really do wonder if, I think innovation, food companies will continue to innovate and have new items to keep consumers excited about trying new things. But I think there's a lot of learnings companies have had on a more efficient way to operate their supply chains. And there are still challenges with inbound raw materials that companies like a General Mills are facing. So I think that at Feeding America, we're looking to that as a very mature channel of donations, and a more of a shift toward what's at the grocery store in terms of the kind of the perimeter of the store, and how we rescue produce, protein, dairy, working with ag growers more and more on how do we, go right to the field to help rescue food, and really moving more and more towards ready to eat food service restaurant food waste, and how can we play a bigger role with that food that really needs, has a 24-hour clock on it and needs to move right from a restaurant to a person in need very quickly. So those are some of the channels that we're looking at, moving from that kind of most mature channel of packaged foods down toward the retail and food service end of things is where we really see the growth.
Yeah, thank you. We could probably break up the last couple of years into several chunks where we've seen shifts in that product mix. So thank you for walking us through that. Brenna, I think this is mostly a question for you. Several of our attendees, I'm imagining on this call, work at the intersection of food waste or sustainable food systems and climate change specifically. And there's a question, I think, referencing your stat about 7 out of 10 households being impacted by food prices, is could food inflation actually be a way to talk more about climate change as its effect on food systems and food waste? We may not get to people with a food waste message, but if they can connect dollars to climate change as maybe the cause of that, could this be an opportunity to increase messaging around climate?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And in the survey I was talking about, we've just done, it's actually a new tracking survey, and we're actually tracking kind of sentiment on people's beliefs about climate change impacting and causing rising food prices, and their concern that will happen. So that's something we're actively investigating now, and I'm happy to share more information with anyone that's interested. But like I said earlier, we do know that the dollar motivators seem to be most effective in getting people to change waste behaviors. And so I think that is a good pathway, if the waste message isn't working, to actually go through the dollar route. I do think that is an effective way to get consumers to pay attention.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that may be a good opportunity to share future resources, and happy to pass those along to attendees. Maybe a question for each of you quickly, and then we might have time for one more after this, but could each of you speak to roles that your organizations and close partners of yours could play in potential national or even regional behavior change campaigns to help consumers save money, stretch their grocery budgets to go further, and waste less food? So just talk to us a little bit about maybe the need for that, and then what role your organizations could play, or any organization should be playing in the consumer education piece. Brenna, I might go back to you right away just with the consumer lens, then we can go to Constantine and Erika if they want to add anything.
Yeah, so I think universities and institutions in general, many of us want to educate not only our students, but, to provide community outreach and education. In fact, I'm on a grant right now, a big NSF proposal that's a research network, and the whole grant is around sustainable food systems. And our component of the grant is actually developing an educational curriculum that focuses on improv or flex cooking. So basically, like, how do you take your pantry and do stuff with it? So it's ideally designed to promote food waste reduction and good food resource management. And so, we are actively working on curriculum to try to teach people, like, just, how to deal with the food you have, basically, like, to do the things my mom does all the time that those skills did not pass on to myself. So how do we retrain our brains to work with the resources that we have, and those types of things. So I do think educational institutions are good partners, at least in terms of developing curriculums and things like that. So that's at least where I see my role.
Thank you. Constantine, you were going to jump in as well, I think.
Yeah, from my perspective, right, I think that, technology can have a very important part in solving some of the food waste issues, right? As an example, Blue Card provides inventory management solutions to our restaurants, right? So this allows these restaurants to operate with just-in-time inventory, so order exactly what they need, not what they anticipate, things of that nature that allow them to minimize some of the waste that we've seen when they have to run operations with paper and pencil, right? So in that sense, technology can have a very clear role in highlighting the problems that they might be facing that they might not know that they actually face, right? So somebody might be under the impression that they have, excellent operations just because they stay alive, right? Meanwhile, they could be making so much more money or saving so much more money or minimizing waste. Something really interesting that I want to kind of go back to is that question about climate change and food prices, right? So there was a really interesting article, and I just pulled it up as Brenna was talking on NPR about, it's called Beyond Almonds. It's essentially how the drought is incentivizing farmers to plant water-thirsty crops, right? So meaning that since there's scarcity in water, water-thirsty crops are much more pricey than they were before. Therefore, they can actually sell at a higher price. They can make more money. So essentially, it's kind of like a vicious loop that makes things even worse, right? So people planting almonds, right, and drying up, aquifers. But since the price of almonds goes up as the drought continues, right, they're further incentivized to plant even more almonds, right? So it's a really interesting article. I encourage you guys to read it. It's called Beyond Almonds, a rogue gallery of guzzlers in California's drought. So that's a clear example of how, the climate change is affecting food prices.
Yeah, thank you, Constantine, for sharing that and going back to that climate question. All right, I want to ask one last question, and maybe Erika, I'll give you a heads up. I'm going to come to you first, but we're going to go around the room on this one. So we've had a very volatile couple of years. Take us forward. What do the next couple of years look like? Where is all this headed? And maybe what's one thing that you're most excited about or concerned about in the next few years ahead of us?
Yeah, it has been a roller coaster. I'm really excited, Jackie, that we've made a bold commitment as a Feeding America organization, but also as just a national call to action that we know we can't do this without support of lots of stakeholders, is to reduce the food insecurity rate, which has been hovering between 10 and 11% in the United States for decades, to reduce that by 50%. With a focus on doing that in a way that does it for communities of color by race and by place, meaning rural, urban, suburban locations. We wanted to get that 50% reduction in place by the year 2030, and we've got an upcoming White House summit on hunger and nutrition that's coming up. So we're really excited to have a national platform to talk about what ways, together with many other partner organizations and stakeholders and individuals, that we can make a difference in really taking that food insecurity rate down. So we're gonna have to do that in a lot of different ways. It'll come through advocacy work on things like SNAP benefits and lunch and breakfast programs for kids at schools, and certainly more access to food support, which it's going to be needed more than ever right now in this inflationary environment. So I think we've got great support from food industry donors. We've got great support from government, and public policy groups and industry groups, and certainly we want to get the general public excited about this White House summit coming up as well, which will be the end of September.
Wow, what a great goal. I think I heard silent claps from our muted attendees on that one, but I think something for all of us to look forward to. Certainly not easy, but something to look forward to in the next few years. Constantine, let's have you go next, and then Brenna can take us home.
Just to kind of like wrap it up, is I think that innovation will be the solution to this problem, right? I do think that innovation coupled with proper sharing of ideas, like it was mentioned earlier, right? A good network of how to share solutions to the problems we face, right? In a consistent way, right? Not just kind of like sporadic. I think will be a way to like address some of these challenging issues that we face.
Okay, and for me, just to wrap up, I think, hopefully based on the projections, we're seeing some stabilization over the next few years. And from a household's perspective, I'm really curious to know how food waste outcomes are impacted. I'm quite confident there are people tracking data. We just haven't seen it yet. But I'm also personally interested in how rising food prices has impacted household diet quality. Like, we know going through the pandemic was stressful enough, and now we've added inflation. And so, anecdotally and in the news, we've seen reports that people are turning to more and more comfort foods, which would result in one set of dietary outcomes. But we also know that eating more at home has, is associated with better dietary health outcomes. And so kind of what is the net effect? I don't think we know. And it will probably vary based on households, right, that may have been shocked more or will experience shocks longer. But really, I'm interested to see what the research says, not only on waste, but also nutrition, because nutrition security is also important, and we need to talk about that as well.
Yeah, really, really great point to end on, Brenna. Thank you. With that, I want to thank all of our panelists, Brenna, Constantine, and Erika, for taking the time to share their expertise. This was an amazing discussion. Also, thanks to our attendees. You have been very active in the chat with some thoughtful questions. There's a lot of resources in there, so take a quick scroll through that if you haven't to click on some of those. And then I mentioned at the beginning that we have a couple quick questions for you. They should be popping up on your screen now. Please take about 10 seconds to answer those so that we can get your input to help us as we plan future events. I'll pause for just a second to let some of those come in. Great, I see those rolling in. Okay, as you continue to respond, I will just let you know that we'll also be sending out an email shortly with a link to the recording of today's webinar. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you have any questions or additional feedback that you want to share outside of the survey, you can do that by reaching out to insights@refed.org. We really value your input to make sure that these are valuable for everyone that's participating. That's all we have for you today. I'll keep this open for just another minute as I see some responses still coming in, but want to say another big thank you to our panelists and wish you all a great day. Thank you for joining us.